Mark of the Thief by Jennifer Nielsen. Chapter 19. Once we cleared the amphitheater, I had no idea where to direct Kayla to fly. She was still bleeding, so I knew she wouldn't get us far. And with that injury, and my weight with the gold, she was on an uneven downward angle. We might not even make it out of the city. I pointed to the Tiber River, the same point we had crossed to enter Rome. If she could clear the city wall, then get us across the water, we had some chance of escaping into the hills. Below us, Roman soldiers had already collected to follow our route. One of them shouted up for us to land at once, or we'd be killed. By now I knew better than that. The more correct order was that after we landed, then we'd be killed. The Emperor had already given his orders concerning both of us. Why would I think they had changed now? I reached down to pat Kayla's shoulder. "Stay strong," I told her. "Look at this mighty city, and how you soar over all of it." We were still higher than even the tallest apartments, and I saw the forum stretched out behind the amphitheater, with its mighty temples and buildings. Rome was so much more beautiful than I'd ever imagined. Kayla had given me the view of the gods. Surely there had never been a city like this in all the world. Perhaps nothing so great or so terrible would ever match this empire again. Kayla's arc took us toward the Tiber River. Once we crossed it and she was healed, we'd have to search for my sister. Then the three of us would find the ends of the Roman Empire, if such a place still existed in this world. Suddenly I heard a whoosh past me and saw an arrow fly through the air. Soldiers had taken to the rooftops and were shooting from there. "Higher, Kayla," I ordered. Kayla started to climb, but she was struggling and couldn't get us beyond the arrow's reach. We were almost to the banks of the river when I turned and saw an arrow coming straight for us. There was no time to think. I stuck out my arm to protect Kayla from any further injuries, and instead felt a sting above my elbow, like 1,000 furious wasps had targeted that one spot. With a cry, I instantly lost my grip and fell from Kayla's back. Panicked, I clutched at empty air, but there was nothing. Nothing but the hard ground lay below, rising up at me far too quickly. Then something curled around my chest and slowed my fall. Kayla had me wrapped inside her talon and was still speeding toward the earth. I yelled at her to slow down, but she only listened when she wanted to. We were lower than the treetops and still diving. Then as smoothly as we had dived, we leveled out. I opened my eyes and saw the nugget of gold inside Kayla's other claw. I had let it go when I fell. Just like that, Kayla had what she wanted, and she released me from her grip like a wad of garbage. I didn't have far to fall, but it wasn't the softest landing either. I rolled to my side and tried to draw in some air. My hands sank into mud, and I realized I was still on the city side of the Tiber River. On my best day, I couldn't swim across, and the way I felt now, I wouldn't make it 3 feet into the water before the current carried me straight into the underworld. Soldiers on the nearby bridge gave a call of alarm and began running toward me with their spears raised. Kayla, somewhere overhead, had vanished. With her injury, I wondered if that was the last I'd ever see of her. My arm was still burning, and I rotated it to see how bad it was. The tip of an arrow was stuck in my flesh, though most of the shaft had broken off in my fall. I couldn't run this way, so with my left hand I grabbed the remaining shaft and yanked. It hurt enough that I screamed, drawing the soldiers to the very spot where I had fallen. They edged down the steep bank with drawn swords. I had to move. Dizzy with pain, I ran. My left hand was clasped tightly over the wound, but blood still dripped between my fingers. I stumbled forward, with no idea of where I could possibly go now. Then in the darkness, I tripped onto a concrete spillway. Water flowed beneath my hands and legs into the river, but the smell was horrible. Felix had already told me what this was. The exit for the Cloaca Maxima. The sewer. I nearly became sick from the odor, but reminded myself that it wasn't too different from what I had smelled beneath the amphitheater. Maybe the stench was stronger here, but I could manage that. I had to. Hopefully the soldiers could not. Another arrow whooshed past me when I took my first step into the sewer, but it hit the far wall. I needed to go faster. I had to crawl in on all fours and duck even lower to squeeze beneath a brick overhang. It was a tight fit, but I was inside. It was almost as dark in here as Caesar's cave had been. Considering how things had been going since that adventure, it was hardly a comforting thought. Even when I got all the way into the sewer, I couldn't quite stand upright, but I moved faster on my feet. Outside, I heard the soldiers arguing about whether they should continue to pursue me. Finally, 2 men were ordered in, chosen because they were smaller than the others. They had a torch with them, casting distorted shadows along the sewer walls. It didn't give me much light, but it was better than nothing and allowed me to move more quickly. A narrow walkway lay on one side, and the sewage steamed in an equally narrow ditch beside it. To keep from falling in, I kept my weight against the wall, ignoring the rough brick that tore up the knuckles of my left hand, still pressed against the open wound in my right arm. In some places, the tunnel became even smaller, forcing me into the mucky water. At least I seemed to be handling the smell better than the 2 soldiers. One in particular had already stopped twice to be sick. His companion said if it happened again, he'd be killed in here. I hurried faster, until I outran the flickering torch and their echoing voices. Surely there would be an outlet soon. I found a few, but they were covered in bars that kept me as caged in as the animals in the Venatio. A few others were open, but so much water poured out from them that I'd never reach the top without drowning. The longer I walked, the more my hopes of finding an exit faded. At one point, the sewer widened and divided into paths, much like the intersection of a road. It was impossible to tell exactly where I was. I didn't know the lines or the outlets to the surface. But I was somewhere beneath Rome, and with so many paths it was probably a busy area. I recalled a large exit opened into the Hypogeum, but Felix would be there, waiting to hand me over to the Emperor. Not exactly the ideal solution to my problems. I turned right, or left, or right again. I walked in any direction. I thought the soldiers wouldn't. If it was dark or small or smelled particularly bad, that was my choice. I ran so far and so fast that when I finally stopped to listen, I heard absolutely nothing. I saw even less. I lost them. But in doing so, I had also lost my way out. I had become a rat in a never-ending maze without food or light or anywhere to rest. I couldn't survive in here, and I'd never be allowed to live if I tried returning to the surface. I stumbled on something that squeaked back and tried not to think about how big it had been. Then, in regaining my footing, I felt the bulla bounce against my waist. It was as heavy as ever, but also cold and lifeless. It had brought so much bad into my life. I couldn't see how anything might get better if I continued to wear it. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to throw it down either. Whether keeping the bulla was a sign of strength or weakness, I didn't know. But I brushed my hand over it and continued on. I stumbled again, but this time fell to the sewer floor, completely indifferent to how it smelled, and without a thought for the filth that surrounded me. Then I removed my hand from my arm and nearly blacked out when my wet fingers dripped into the wound. The pain was beyond anything I'd ever before experienced. The only reason I didn't scream was that I was too frightened and exhausted to make so much noise. Tears came to my eyes, but not from the pain. The harder I tried to make things better, the worse they got. Only days ago I was a slave in the mines, a hopeless situation, but at least it was a life I knew. Nicholas, you are the head of our family now. After she was sold away from us, my mother had cried those words as she was being led away in chains. I'm relying on you to protect your sister. I will, I had promised her through my tears. Always. Stay together because I will see you again, she'd said, if the gods are willing. And then she was gone. Whatever my fate, I had absolutely failed my family. And that was the worst thought of all. With little hope and even less of an idea of what direction to go, I finally forced myself to my feet. Maybe the gods would seal me in here forever and laugh at my failures. But until they did, I had no choice but to continue searching for a way out. Chapter 20. The bleeding in my arm eventually stopped, though the pain erupted every time I stumbled off the narrow pathway and fell into the sewage. My eyes had adjusted a little, but then I'd spot a grate overhead where the sunlight poured in, and the darkness beyond it would turn black again. It had been 2 full days since I became lost in here, and nighttime was approaching again. Except for one grate that had poured in clean water, I hadn't had anything to drink, and nothing at all to eat. Despite that, and the endless ache in my arm, the worst pain came with the realization of how stupid I'd been. Unforgivably foolish. Sal had been right. From the moment of my birth, I was cursed. Born in poverty, to a father who lost a half-second battle with a lightning bolt, and a mother who gave up hope for us too soon. The bulla, a mistake of my own doing, was a second curse. Kayla had abandoned me. Radolf knew I was alive and held the bulla, and the Empire had turned on me, just as Aurelia had predicted. Aurelia. Something flashed in my memory from our last fight. Hadn't she said that she lived below ground? I had always pictured her in some sort of mine, but there were no mines in Rome. This was what she had meant. Aurelia had to be here somewhere, in the sewers. We hadn't exactly parted on good terms, but she might be my only chance of survival. I wandered on farther, trying to convince myself that she was down here and probably knew this maze well enough to walk through it blindfolded. If she used the sewers, then she knew the ways in and the ways out. She would have food, and perhaps a solution for the growing pain in my injured arm. Whether she would share any of that with me, however, was a question I preferred not to think about. Despite my hopes, as day faded to night, the sewer walls all became the same again. I didn't dare call her name for fear of someone above hearing me and reporting where I had escaped. It was probably useless anyway. If only I knew where I was. I'd gone for miles in infinite loops, likely repeating the same senseless steps that I'd crossed a dozen times already. My injured arm throbbed, and the hunger that had gnawed at me was now becoming a warning of how serious the situation was if I didn't find food and clean water soon. Eventually, I was forced to rest on the narrow walkway, every part of me feeling shredded apart. I leaned against the brick wall, which was covered in a slimy moss that could only have grown from the underworld. I reached for the bulla, hoping to draw in some of its warmth, but it had slid around to my back, and I didn't have the strength to retrieve it. I must have fallen asleep that way, and sometime later awoke to a fierce ache in the mark on my shoulder. It froze me in place at first, as I struggled to move my arms and unclench my teeth. In my sleep I had rolled onto the bulla, which was now sucking strength from the divine star into itself. But it was doing more than pulling out my strength. Magic was going with it. Finally, I was able to shift enough to move the bulla. The ache immediately stopped, though it was several minutes before I was breathing evenly again. Oddly, the bulla then began to replenish my strength, returning to me what it had just stolen. As I lay there, I began to wonder how Radolf stole magic from others with the divine star. He had no bulla, but the effects Crispus had described to me seemed similar to what I'd just experienced. With pain like that, hopefully I never would again. Once my strength returned, I began to walk again, weighing the few things I already knew about Radolf and what I understood about magic. There had to be a way to save my life. Once I escaped these sewers, I would find it. I crossed to a grate overhead, one of hundreds I had seen over the last few days, but every one of them was sealed, or too far above my head to reach, or too small. This one wasn't much better, but at least it seemed to be in a quiet part of the city, and I had a way to climb up to it. All I needed was to make the opening larger. Perhaps with the bulla's help I could collapse the rock around it. That was where I stopped. The memory of what I'd done in the amphitheater was still raw. When he fell, the bestiarius would have been seriously injured. Or maybe worse, though I hated to think about that. Clearly I had drawn upon the magic in the bulla, somehow. I still wasn't sure if the magic was good or bad, which meant I could no longer be sure whether I was good or bad. But it saved my life before, and I needed it again. So I raised my hand and tried to summon enough strength to push the grate out of its place. All I needed was to spread the rock farther apart, or for a couple of rocks to fall. With the right tools back at the mine, I could have done this in an hour. But here I felt ridiculous, attempting it by only willing it to happen. And this time my will was not enough. The bulla had gone cold on me, maybe because I was afraid to use it. Without even meaning to do anything, I had unleashed a magic in the arena that I did not understand and could not control. There were thousands of people at the games, every one of them endangered because of my recklessness. For all I knew, using magic in these tunnels might bring an entire street down over my head, and any number of people with it. Only the gods were meant to have magic. It was never intended for someone like me. I grabbed the bulla's strap and tried to pull it over my injured arm, but my arm ached too badly to move it. So instead I cursed loud enough for the gods to hear and kicked at the sewer wall with all the strength I had left. "It's dangerous for any slave to have such a temper," someone said. "It's worse when that slave has the power to use its temper against 50,000 people." Aurelia. I swerved around so fast that I slipped and fell back into the sewage again. With the sting in my arm, I sprang back to my feet with lightning speed, and then bumped my head on the curved wall above me. Truly, my grace was no better than my magic. Aurelia stood in front of me, arms crossed and eyes narrowed, like she was staring at a madman. Even in the darkness, I saw that Aurelia was better armed than she had been on the surface. She had a bow slung over one shoulder, and a quiver full of arrows on her back. She had all sorts of tiny sachets attached to a belt around her waist, as well as a long knife I had seen before. As far as I knew, she was armed in 20 other ways I couldn't even see. It's not a temper, just desperation. I stepped toward her. I need help. She took the same number of steps backward and put a hand on her knife. Don't come any closer, Nick. I'm warning you. I stopped, and though the little light seeping in from the grate, I tried to read her expression. Her eyes were weary and watchful, and her jaw was tense. She was afraid of me, probably for good reason. I raised one hand to her, hoping to show I wasn't armed, but she flinched. I won't hurt you, I said. I would never. I was in the amphitheater. I saw what you did. Lots of people got hurt trying to escape. Some people didn't escape at all. The hand of my injured arm wrapped over the bulla as it warmed again. I don't know how that happened. I didn't mean for any of that. My explanation wasn't working. She shook her head, undoubtedly trying to figure out how to get away from me. But I couldn't let that happen. With every passing moment, I felt another piece of my life slipping away. I was dying in here. Are you all right? She asked. The bulla finally warmed and traveled to the wing of my shoulder. Everything about me felt warm, even hot. I didn't want to feel magic now. Not when I was trying to convince her there was no danger in being near me. No, I mumbled, not sure if I was responding to her or trying to command the bulla. I fought against the heat inside, but as weak as I was, the magic wanted to take over. Not here. Not now. Not ever again. A sudden feeling of dizziness swam through me. I set a hand on the sewer wall to keep myself from falling, and the wall shook, as if something were trying to break out from behind it. It happened only once, but it startled me and I immediately let go. Aurelia put out both hands as if ready for a fight. Did you do that? Please help me. I was about to black out. I'm drowning. I lowered my hand and took another step forward. Before I had any chance to react, she kicked out a leg and connected directly with the wound in my arm. I cried out with pain and splashed into the rancid water, but this time I couldn't get up again. The bullet tried to help. I felt it trying, but there was nothing left inside me now. I'm sorry. She crouched down to help me up. You scared me, that's all. She grabbed my hand, then touched it with her other hand. Nick, you're burning with fever. Her hand ran up to the injury in my arm, and through my haze, I heard her draw in a breath. It's infected. I won't hurt you, I said, and then everything faded around me.